Time for another edition of the Improbability Engine, and today my buddy Joe Darnell and I will be talking about comedy, because after all, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is what our show is kind of honoring or
Happy Towel Day early, everybody!
Yes, Towel Day's in 2 days. It was, at its heart, a comedy, more than anything else, an absurdist comedy. So let's talk about comedy and comedians.
So when we talk about comedians, to me, I always break these guys down a little differently. I think that currently my favorite comedian is the late Mitch Hedberg.
Never heard of him.
Mitch, if you get a chance, Mitch Hedberg was a really deadpan comedian.
Kind of like Stephen Wright.
Similar to Stephen Wright in a lot of ways. So not vocally deadpan, but he's not Jim Carrey.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So one of Mitch Hedberg's jokes is rice is something good to eat if you want to eat 20,000 of something.
Okay,
something like that. I was like, I went to the store and bought a donut, and they gave me a receipt for the donut. I said, I just bought a donut. There's no reason to bring pen and paper into this. Stuff like that, where it's observational, but it's hilarious. If you get a chance, watch Mitch Hedberg. He's hilarious. To me, comedy is a very personal thing, and it affects each person on a personal level. I mean, when I was a kid, I loved Ray Stevens. And basically that's a strange, turned on its ear version of reality for kids growing up in the South. I mean, that's what you talk about. So when we talk about comedy, it's all about relating and how you relate to certain things.
As for comedians, my favorite is probably Sam Kinison. He was just, to me, hilarious, and I love the shtick at the end of each of his shows, where he would ask if there was any man in the audience who had just had his heart torn out by a woman, and he would always find somebody, get the girl's phone number, and then call her on the phone.
That to me, you want to win over an audience, find someone. We talk about, when you connect with somebody, that is the definition of connecting, because everybody in that audience has had their heart broken. It's just a reality of life. And what does he do? He immediately goes directly after that person, and you now can laugh at the bad guy. Who doesn't want to laugh at the bad guy?
Absolutely.
Everybody does. So the next comedian that I want to bring up, Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks, now, we don't think of him as a stand-up comedian, but that's how he got his start. He actually started as a stand-up comedian with a skit called The 10,000-Year-Old Man. Now, it's very tame by today's standards, coming out in the 60s or 50s is the way he did, but fantastic concept. And he brings an air of absurdity to things that people consider serious. So he went from there. He became a writer in television, did some really funny shows, was one of the head writers on Get Smart, which was a spoof of spy movies at the time, which I always loved. Get Smart. I thought that was it was a funny show, but it was one that it poked fun of serious things, poked fun of the Cold War, and poked fun of the defense apparatus, which at that point no one jokes about the CIA. Nobody jokes about spies. This is James Bond stuff. He just kind of put it on its ear. Some of my favorite things are his movies. Now, the two that always jump out to me, Blazing Saddles.
Hilarious.
A black sheriff? You know what I mean? He puns himself. Whenever he gets to Robin Hood Men in Tights, they go, a black sheriff? He goes, why not? It worked in Blazing Saddles. And oh yeah, that's right. Fantastic movie. It is a cultural icon, and it's hilarious. The second one is Young Frankenstein. Now, Gene Wilder is amazing in that movie. The fact that, that you look at what he's doing, taking it seriously, he says, okay, we're going to take all the same props from the 1930s Frankenstein movie. We're going to use those in this spoof. You know, we're gonna find a way to make this work. You know, Frankenstein, you know, stuff like that. It's just hilarious.
You mentioned Gene Wilder. I am perhaps the world's biggest fan of The Adventures of Letterman. Now, The Adventures of Letterman was a cartoon short that was part of the Electric Company, like back in the 70s. Listen to who was in The Adventures of Letterman. Gene Wilder, Zero Mostel, and Joan Rivers.
That'll work.
The shows lasted about a minute to 2 minutes each. It was a short, but huge names. It was as funny as all get out.
Yeah.
And fortunately, a lot of it has been preserved on YouTube. Just search for The Adventures of Letterman. It's hilarious.
You know, and I think that goes back to how we are exposed to these comedians first. I remember a buddy of mine had an album that he had swiped from his parents that was Richard Pryor. Now, Richard Pryor was about as blue as it gets for comedians. This is a guy, though, that absolutely killed it. He was funny, and I can't think of a single thing that he did that he was not funny in. I mean, going up, the movie The Toy, where he plays a black man who's hired by a rich white man to play with his son as a toy. I mean, you're talking about from a highbrow perspective. You're looking at this. This is, you know, the new face of racism is this idea that the rich can buy and sell the poor. It's slavery all over again. It's just changed its face. At the very small scale, it's hilarious. He does these things that, you know, this is a fairly mainstream comedy. He takes something that's so dark and could be terribly heavy, and he turns it into something that's light and funny, and actually was available to mainstream audiences. And he was fantastic in it. And I mean, anytime you can do that kind of thing, and kind of, you know, have one eye on the laugh and one eye on the story, you're doing something great.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was hilarious in an absurd way.
Yeah, to the nth degree absurd.
And
it's Dianetics with a laugh track.
Yes. Now, I realize a lot of people haven't seen it, but
you should. You really should.
You really should. But everybody's familiar with The Far Side.
Absolutely.
It's the same kind of approach to comedy as The Far Side or Dr. Fun. And you can find Dr. Fun on the internet. Just Google Dr. Fun Archive. And just to give you an idea of what Dr. Fun was like, there's one of the comic strips where it's a funeral and there are Christmas trees instead of people. And the eulogy is given by a Christmas tree. And they're talking about the dear departed, and they say, he had big balls, big shiny balls.
You could, and you know what? You have options there. The punchline could be, you know, he really lit up a room.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I remember right before he passed, I walked in, he was glowing. There's so much there. It always seemed he had an angel on his shoulder. The idea that this is an absurdism that leads you to just say, you know what, let's turn it all upside down. Let's just flip it all the way around. There's something great about that. You know, nothing is too big to make fun of. I think on the other side, I look at George Carlin. Nothing is too small to make fun of.
Or too big. I mean,
he played both directions.
He has some unfortunately true, but bitingly hilarious political commentary.
Absolutely, and was not only was he funny. I mean, let's just start with he's funny, but incredibly insightful and incredibly smart. I mean, he could just look at something and turn it just a little bit, you know.
And he evolved.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
the early George Carlin skits like Al Sleeth, the hippy dippy weatherman.
Right.
I mean, that's nothing like what he did
Right.
in the later years.
Well, and it was all about, you know, that evolution of a comedian. I mean, when we look, I brought up Carlin because Carlin to me belongs on the Mount Rushmore of comedians, and you know, when you think about that, you have to be relevant for a long time, and it's hard for a comedian to be relevant for a long time, because generally speaking, what you're doing now isn't going to be funny in 2 years. So you better be able to adjust and evolve, and George Carlin did that. I mean, he went from making fun of the hippies, which was easy, you know, tonight's weather forecast, dark, with continued dark until morning. I mean, it's funny, ha 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 ha. But to go from that to some of the commentary that he did later on, that, you know, you put him up there with some of the great philosophers trying to do, you know, certain things. When they turn something on its ear and you say, yeah, that's absurd. You know, when you take something to, you know, reductio ad absurdum, and you can actually take something large and grand and important and reduce it down to something that shows its inability to function, or it's the inherent lie that bakes it up. That's the ultimate goal of any philosopher. So when you can do that and make people laugh, holy cow, you've done something.
Art Buchwald was very good at that kind of thing with the satire that he wrote back in the 60s and 70s. And, you know, we have satire today all over the internet, but it doesn't rise to the level of what Art Buchwald did. I still remember a column that he wrote.
Pop culture satire. It's satire that's, you know, a lot of people doing some satire. What you don't have is the highly intellectual satire that you're talking about. The
Right.
stuff that's hard-hitting and generational and powerful and moving. I agree with that.
He did a piece during the Tet Offensive, which, for those who aren't familiar
Learn
with
history, people.
For those who aren't familiar with the
Read a book.
Vietnam
Come
War,
on.
it's
Keep up.
yeah. Look up the Vietnam War and the Tet Offensive.
Yeah, Tet Offensive.
Anyway, comparing it to Custer's Last Stand, but the column was about Custer's Last Stand. It never mentioned the Tet Offensive.
Absolutely.
But it became clear that that was what he was talking about, because, I mean, there were several places like, you know, General Custer, we're down to 30 men, but we've killed 10 times as many of them as they've killed of us. And, you know, and eventually it gets down to where they're all dead.
Right, yeah. You know, to me, whenever you get to that point where you can talk about something and everybody knows what you're talking about, but you never say that thing, I think that to me is a very powerful statement. I always think of MASH whenever I think of that from a pop culture standpoint. A television show about the Korean War that was nothing to do with the Korean War.
Yeah.
It was about Vietnam.
Absolutely.
It was 100% about Vietnam. And you watch it, and the emotional roller coaster you get from it isn't that this is some lighthearted comedy, which it starts out as. The arc of MASH started out, the movie and the book were very, you know, acerbic. They were very, you know, they biting about how
suicide is painless.
Suicide is painless. It's this idea that, you know, we're over here fighting to make the world safe for democracy, and we don't have safe democracy in the United States, which is this concept that we had for so long. The movie was the same way. It was a sex-fueled romp. It was, you know, alcohol binges. It was, we're not perfect, and yet we hold ourselves up to be this moral icon. by the time it got to television, it had lost a lot of that early on. But once it became a hit, they started taking back that moral talking point. You had a lot of discussions about whether the war was worth it. Why are we demonizing people who believe different things from us?
Well, and there's an awesome episode where one of the patients thinks he's Jesus.
Yeah, great episode. Great episode. Yeah, you find that you can, if you put it in a situation where you've got the Americans as the good guys and the enemies of America as bad guys, you can shine a light on a lot of things and never really push everyone away. I often think there was one where they were exchanging wounded soldiers with the North Koreans and the Chinese. And Hawkeye goes to meet with his counterpart at a bridge, and they're going to exchange wounded soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes up there and he's talking, and, you know, being Hawkeye, he ends up finding out that the guy that he's across from speaks English. And not only does he speak English, he went to medical school at the University of Chicago. And you have this interplay of this, you know, this is a person. This isn't some monolithic evil empire that you're facing. I think one of the things that good satire does is it makes you question the party line. You know what I mean? You ask the question, you know, whenever, as a kid, it's very simple. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. When you become an adult, it's a much more nuanced position, and understanding that nuance determines your view on a lot of things. And so whenever you look at good satire and good comedy in general, it makes you question, what's the nuance level here? You know, the harder people push one direction, the more nuanced it is and the less solid your ground is. And I think that's what good comedy does.
And that brings to a close this edition of the Improbability Engine.